Welcome back to Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. We're glad you've tuned in today. Today we want to tackle a question that we hear quite frequently. Actually, we want to tackle two questions, but because the two questions are closely related, we thought we'd just ask both of them at the same time, Dr. Bernard. That question has to do, or I should say these questions have to do with really two practices. One is yoga, and the other is martial arts. While those are obviously two very different practices, people ask them the question, are those okay for a Christian, for the same reason, and that is yoga and many martial arts, as you know, have their roots in Eastern religions. So as far as we know, yoga has roots in Hinduism and Buddhism, and various martial arts have roots in various Eastern religions. So the question that people ask then, that we're presenting to you today, is, considering their connections to non-Christian religions, should Christians participate in yoga or martial arts?
That's a good question, and I was raised in Korea, so which was and still is a non-Christian nation, and so I'm well aware of these connections, and I certainly would advise caution. But as with so many things, a lot depends on how you define it. So yoga as a spiritual practice, as you said, would be associated with Hinduism and Buddhism. We should not participate. Many martial arts have a component of meditation and honoring spirits, and we should not participate. But yoga, that term is also used in Western culture to mean strictly certain forms of exercise. And of course, martial arts can be used in a very secular context simply for self-defense. And so if you're talking about exercise or self-defense, I do not find those contrary to Scripture. But if you're talking about spiritual meditation, for example, some yoga practices require you to chant certain things. Well, find out what you're chanting. What you're chanting is mantras or Hebrew or Buddhist phrases that are supposed to have spiritual power. Well, obviously, we wouldn't want to do that because we're not being connected to the true God. We'd be either connected to a false spirits, or would be connected to a fakery. And either way, we don't want to do that. So I think there's an area of Christian liberty, of personal choice. So here's what I would say. If you're talking about these things as spiritual techniques or associated with spiritual meditation, then Christians should absolutely stay away from them. If you are talking about various forms of exercise or self-defense that derive some of these examples of years gone by from folklore, folk examples, then I think that it's not sinful to participate in exercise techniques or self-defense techniques. Now, where the area of Christian liberty might be, somebody might say, well, I'm absolutely not involved in any kind of spiritual meditation. I'm not involved in any kind of spiritual chanting. I'm not involved in any kind of worship of gods, but I don't want anybody to misunderstand, or I don't want to inadvertently may endorse something. Well, that's where you'd have Christian liberty to say, so therefore I'm not going to participate. But somebody else may say, I'm just exercising. I'm just conducting, learning how to defend myself. Well, then I don't think we should condemn that person. You're not doing anything spiritually wrong. You are simply learning to defend yourself. So, for example, as I said, I grew up in Korea, so as a teenager, I briefly studied, and it was in a Christian context, by the way, judo. And the first thing they taught me was, if there is any situation of confrontation, rule number one is to escape. If you can run away, diffuse the situation, always do that. Never counterattack, leave. That's interesting. The second thing they taught you is how to fall without hurting yourself. Then the third thing they taught you was how to use your opponent's momentum to defeat himself. So in other words, you're not trying to counterattack and seriously injure that opponent, but let's say somebody lunges at you. Well, you sidestep and you trip them, and they fall down, and then you run away. Or they come at you with their fist, and you just take their arm and use their own momentum and just pull them in the natural trajectory of where they're headed, and they go flying off in the distance, then you run away. So it's hard to say there's anything wrong with that. In fact, the way I described it, and maybe not all martial arts are that way, but really the way they taught us is to be very respectful of other people, respectful of human life, diffuse controversies, not, we sometimes get the idea the martial arts person is just violent, always fighting. Well, that was not the original intention of these martial arts. It was more of self-preservation, self-defense, and even military use. So, and of course today, military personnel are sometimes trained in these techniques. So actually, what I learned were some very helpful techniques of diffusing a situation. If you can't diffuse a situation, defend yourself with minimal harm to either you or the other person, thwarting the person and using their own aggression, their own momentum to work against them, to buy you time to, again, escape. So it's hard to say that those specific techniques would be wrong. And in fact, there's much to be said even for a young person or a woman to have some self-defense techniques that could give them time to get help or to escape, preserve their life in times of danger. And so I think we should take a judicious approach to that. If you're interested in anything like this, study it. Make sure that what you're doing will not in any way connect with any false spiritual practices. But if you can do something for the purpose of wholesome exercise, that is a scriptural, stewardship of the body is a scriptural principle, and self-defense, I think God is not in favor of aggression or hurting someone without cause. And so sometimes we get in situations beyond our control. If we can find the least violent or least destructive means to extricate ourselves, I think that would also be the will of God for us. So I think we have to consider the whole subject. And really, the answer to the question to a great extent depends on what are you defining as the actual practice that you're interested in pursuing.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. If you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to Dr. Bernard's channel, like this video, and leave a comment. We also encourage you to check out Dr. Bernard's books. Visit pentecostalpublishing.com and search for David Bernard to access a full list of titles. Don't forget to enter DKB10 at checkout to save 10% on your order. We look forward to seeing you again next week as we explore how modern-day believers can live out the teachings of the first century church.